guys, welcome to the first episode of Fatal. My name is Beth McCarty, and I'm going to be your host. I have a deep love for true crime, and I've always thought of it as kind of a weird hobby, until I started listening to podcasts, reading books, and watching all of the true crime TV shows. Now I can say I have found my people. I am planning on having a new episode every week, and I just want to thank you in advance for all of your support. If you like this podcast, please be sure to subscribe and review us in iTunes. Now, let's get started with the first episode. Our first episode is about the kidnapping and imprisonment of Colleen Stan. On May 19th, 1977, Colleen Stan was 20 years old. She was hitchhiking from her home in Eugene, Oregon, to a friend's house in Westwood, a small town in Northern California, about 400 miles away. She had made pretty good time, and after just 2 rides, she was within 100 miles of her destination. She was on the highway trying to hitch another ride for the remainder of the trip. Colleen was a pretty experienced hitchhiker, and hitchhiking was pretty common in the 70s. It was very popular among young adults who overlooked the danger or thought, like Colleen, that they could gauge someone just by meeting them for a short few seconds. She did allow a couple of rides to go past, one being a van full of guys. Using her better judgment, she decided to decline their offer for a ride. She also declined one other offer that was given by a couple, but they weren't traveling that far, just a short distance, so she figured she'd be better off waiting for the next offer. She did, however, accept a ride when a blue Dodge Colt pulled up on the side of the road. In the car was Cameron Hooker. He was accompanied by his wife Janice and their 8-month-old baby. Colleen was under the impression that she would be safe with a family, and she thought they looked clean-cut and friendly. Cameron was 23 years old, and his wife Janice was 19 at the time. While driving just a short distance, about 10 minutes or so, she noticed that the man was checking her out a lot in the rearview mirror. She thought it was kind of creepy, but she also thought that maybe she was just overreacting. They stopped at a gas station along the way. This was about 10 minutes into that trip, and Colleen got out to use the restroom. She later said in interviews that at the time, a voice told her that she needed to run, jump out a window, and never look back. But she calmed herself down, telling herself she was just being paranoid, and she returned to the car. About 30 minutes after she got into the car, the couple was having a conversation about ice caves in the nearby area. Cameron asked Colleen if she would mind if they stopped to look at some. Colleen was pretty anxious to get to her friends in Westwood, but she said she wouldn't mind a short detour. Cameron pulled off a dirt road. Janice and the baby got out of the car and went to a nearby stream. You could see them from the window of the car. Cameron came around to the back seat. He climbed in and held a knife to Colleen's throat and threatened to kill her. He told her that she would have to do everything he asked her to do. He then bound her, gagged her, and placed a homemade wooden box over her head, which was designed to keep light, sound, and fresh air out. The box was heavy, weighing nearly 20 pounds, and it was hot and suffocating inside the box, which was lined with carpet. Before the kidnapping took place, Cameron and his wife, Janice, had kind of planned it out. They had discussed how Cameron would be allowed to kidnap one woman to use as a slave to take Janice's place. Up until this abduction, he had been using Janice to act out his sexual bondage fantasies. They had set up a couple of rules for the kidnapping. The number one rule being there was to be no sex with the victim. On the first night of her abduction, Colleen was taken to 1140 Oak Street in Red Bluff, California. This was the home of Cameron and Janice Hooker. Colleen was led to the basement, stripped naked, strung up by her hands, and then physically attacked by Cameron with a whip. She had welts come up all over her body. She was also blindfolded and suspended off the ground, strapped to a pipe, while the couple had sex below her. After the couple was finished, the wife, Janice, went back upstairs, and Colleen was once again left alone with Cameron. He unbound her from the pipe she was strapped to, and while she was still blindfolded, he led her to another box. This box was about 3 feet tall. Her arms were chained to the roof of the box. The box was really cramped, and now her arms were awkwardly suspended above her body. Her head was also placed back into the original head box from the car. Cameron had found a way to affix the head box to the roof of this 3-foot box. During her time in the basement, Colleen said she was usually given 1 meal a day and water to drink, and after she ate, she was allowed to use a bedpan to relieve herself. The Saturday after Colleen's abduction, her roommate began to worry. She had expected Colleen to be back on that Saturday, but she figured that she must have decided to stay on at her friend's house a little longer. By Monday, she was really worried, though, and she called Colleen's mom to see if she was there. Colleen's mom said that she hadn't seen her or heard from her, and now they were both pretty worried. Her roommate had no way to get in touch with the friend that Colleen went to visit in Westwood, but she did contact Westwood police, who then contacted that friend, Linda. Linda said that she had not seen Colleen in quite some time, and that Colleen had never made it to her house. A missing persons report was filed. The missing persons report stated, Stan, Colleen Jean, date of birth, December 31st, 1956, white female, 5 feet 6 inches tall, 135 pounds, long, light brown hair, blue eyes, freckles. Last seen wearing a gray t-shirt, blue jeans, plaid jacket, brown shoes. She has a sleeping bag, sweater, and purse. There was no response from that missing persons bulletin, and it was soon filed and forgotten. Cameron continued to be Colleen's main abuser. He frequently whipped, strangled, and burned her with a heat lamp. About 6 months into her captivity, Colleen finally learned the names of her captors. She was able to peek through a gap in the bottom of the blindfold and spied that Cameron was wearing a belt with his name engraved on it. She had thought that she before had heard his wife call him by that name before, but this just confirmed it. She also learned that Cameron called his wife Jan. This was the first real bit of information she gained during the first several months at their home. It was also about this time that Cameron started putting Colleen to work. She would still be blindfolded and chained, or put in the head box, but she was working on some wood projects for Cameron, sanding the wood down. The work took a lot out of her, since she had no form of exercise or energy from enduring her current living conditions. She was locked in a makeshift closet, and at one point, locked in the closet, a bag of walnuts was thrown at her feet. This was the first time in 6 months that she was allowed to take her blindfold off. Cameron told her to shell all of the walnuts. Colleen says that she was locked in a box for up to 23 hours a day until January of 1978. This was about 8 months after her abduction. She was forced to sign a contract, giving herself over as a slave to Cameron for life. She also confessed that Cameron led her to believe that she was being watched by a large, powerful organization that he referred to as the Company. They were supposed to be heavily involved in human trafficking and kidnapping sex slaves. She was told that the Company would painfully torture her and harm her family if she ever attempted to escape. After signing the contract, Colleen was from then on referred to as K, the letter. It was now her slave name, and she was forced to refer to Cameron as Master. With the contract signed, she was now allowed to come out of the basement. She was still not able to talk without permission, and she was still blindfolded and chained up. At this point, Colleen had not been raped by Cameron. He did have that agreement with Janice. But Janice was starting to get jealous and doubtful. To test him, she asked him if he wanted to bring Kay up from the basement to have sex with her one night. She did regret asking because a few short minutes later, Kay was tied up in their bed, and Cameron was in between the two women. He was kissing and touching them both before he rolled over on top of Colleen and started raping her. Janice couldn't take it, and she ran out of the bedroom to the bathroom so she could be sick. During the time she was held captive in the couple's home, Colleen was stretched on a rack, regularly whipped and beaten, deprived of food, burned, routinely raped, and repeatedly electrocuted. The Hooker family moved to a mobile home in Red Bluff, California, taking Colleen with them. While here, Colleen was kept in a wooden box and hidden under the couple's waterbed. In 1978, Janice actually gave birth to the couple's second child on that waterbed, directly above Colleen. Colleen said after the birth, she was allowed out of her box for a short time just to meet the new baby. Then she was quickly locked back away. For the first few years after the abduction, Colleen was only able to get out of her coffin-sized box for a couple of hours per day, and that was usually to clean the couple's house or to watch their children. She was only given a shower or bath about once every 2 weeks. And Cameron would get her out often while Janice was at work so he could beat her, torture her, and rape her. There was a period, however, that Colleen remembers that lasted about a year, what she refers to as the year of freedom. The Hookers had introduced her to their neighbors as Kay, their live-in babysitter and housekeeper. And with Kay's new freedom, she was allowed to go jogging unsupervised and on a regular basis. Though she still had to ask permission each time, and Cameron mapped out the route she would take, and he even timed her. She was also able to work in the yard. She would sometimes start as early as dawn, as it was hard, hot work, but anything was better than being locked in that box all day. After that first 3.5 years or so, Colleen was actually able to see her parents in 1981. Colleen was told how lucky she was that the company had decided that she was worthy enough to visit with her family. Cameron made Colleen go around to all the neighbors and his daughters and tell them that she was leaving, and she said her goodbyes. By this time, Colleen was so brainwashed and frightened by Cameron's story of the company that she didn't tell her mother and father that she had been kidnapped and forced into sexual slavery. Instead, she did exactly as Cameron had told her. She introduced him as her fiancé, Mike Powers, which was supposedly his name given by the company. Her parents even took a picture of the happy couple to document being reunited with their daughter and meeting the man they thought she intended to marry. Her parents were concerned for her as they thought that she had joined a cult. She was really thin and wearing homemade clothes, but they had no real clue of the abuse and torture that she had suffered. They were also worried to push the issue, fearing that she would not come back to visit them if they tried to interfere. The visit lasted a short 24 hours. Then Cameron called her and said he was on his way to pick her up. He had told her in the beginning that the visit would last all weekend, but he cut the visit short with no explanation. According to Colleen, Cameron began to worry that he had given her too much freedom. Colleen feared the company so much she wouldn't ever attempt to make an escape. But after that visit with her parents and Cameron's growing fear, Cameron locked Colleen in the coffin-sized box again for up to 23 hours a day for the next 3.5 years. If she had to use the bathroom, she used a bedpan, which was placed down by her feet, and she would have to use her feet to hook underneath her. She was reportedly not allowed to make any noise and had to lay still for the entirety of her time in the box, as there was little air to breathe. This was even worse during the summer months, where temperatures reached over 100 degrees in the box. There were times that she felt so dehydrated, and she would hallucinate as well. Somewhere in this time, Cameron and Janice actually let Colleen out of her box to celebrate her birthday. She was given cake and a gift. It was a Bible, which they inscribed for her when she asked, with their real names. In 1983, for some reason that was never really explained to Colleen, she was reintroduced to the world. She was told that the company had decided that she had been good, and she was even allowed to get a job in a local motel as a maid. And Janice had started letting Colleen out of the box even more while Cameron was at work and the girls were at school. During this time, the women would do Bible study together. This seemed to be a turning point for Janice. And Janice later confessed that as early as their first date, she was also brainwashed and tortured by Cameron over the years. She was only able to survive the relationship, she says, because of denial. When Colleen started working, it seemed that Cameron's attacks on her became less frequent, and his behavior and treatment of Janice started getting violent again. Colleen remembered one time when he had let her out of the box to watch the children, and he had taken Janice into the bedroom to beat and torture her. Cameron had told Janice he was planning on kidnapping 4 more slaves, and he told Colleen that she had been such a good slave that she would get to help him train the new ones. On August 9th, 1984, Janice really began to struggle with herself, and she spoke with the pastor at her church. Her pastor told her that she was living in sin and convinced her to get out of the situation. She told Colleen that Cameron was not part of the company. She did maintain that the organization still existed, but she said that they both needed to get away from Cameron. So Janice and Colleen decided that they would wait until the next morning when Cameron left for work, and then they would flee. And that is exactly what they did. They hurriedly packed as much as they could, and with the children, they fled to Janice's parents' home. Once they were there, Colleen called her father and asked him to send her the money for a bus ticket home. While Colleen was waiting for the bus, she called Cameron. She told him that she knew that he had lied about everything and that she was leaving and he couldn't keep her there anymore. Colleen said she doesn't remember a lot about that conversation, but she does remember that Cameron cried. It didn't take long for Janice to waver in her decision to leave Cameron. He had come to her parents' house and called and begged her to come back to him, promising that he would change. And after a week, she caved and went back. Over the next several weeks, Colleen did not go to the police immediately. She was trying to get back into some feeling of normalcy, she said. She had become so dependent on the hookers for everything. She found it difficult to completely cut herself off from them. She had several phone conversations with Janice and Cameron during those weeks. She assured them both that she was not going to the police. However, that fall, Janice left Cameron for good. She was so worried that he was going to kidnap another woman, and she could not eat or sleep. She feared it would start all over again, and she was having lots of panic attacks. On November 7th, 1984, Janice sat down with her pastor and told him everything. And after several hours of talking and convincing, the pastor called the police. While she was being interviewed by the police, Janice was so distraught. She said that she thought she was going to have a nervous breakdown. And during the questioning, she told the officials that Cameron was also responsible for another woman's disappearance, Marie Elizabeth Spanicky. Marie had disappeared in 1976. Janice claimed that they had picked her up, and Cameron had murdered her that same night. Authorities were not able to find any remains of Marie, and due to lack of evidence or proof, no murder charges have been brought against Cameron for Marie's murder. In fact, the case for Marie Spanicky is still open. After interviewing Janice, the detectives got search warrants for the house on Oak Street and the mobile home. The next step was to contact Colleen. The detectives traveled to Colleen's father's house to conduct the interview. She told them the story of her kidnapping and the torture that she had endured during her imprisonment. When asked why she didn't report it to the police once she had escaped, she simply said that Janice had asked her not to. They both had hopes that Cameron would be rehabilitated and be able to stop his behavior. She said turning him in now was in no way for revenge, but just to make sure that it would never happen to anyone else. On November 18th, officials drove to the Hooker residence. Cameron had no idea that the police had even been called at this point. He was read his rights and chose to exercise his right to remain silent, requesting a lawyer immediately. They did, however, have warrants to search his property. Cameron had destroyed or gotten rid of most of the torture equipment. Only some remained. The head box, some hooks mounted to the ceiling where Colleen had been suspended, and the coffin-sized box underneath the waterbed. Some other evidence that was gathered were 2 rolls of undeveloped film Once developed, there were pictures of the equipment used, a photo of the contract, and pictures of Colleen tied to the rack or suspended, as well as pictures of Janice. Neighbors described Cameron as a nice, courteous, quiet, and friendly guy, but no one really knew him that well. He kept to himself and was also described as easy to get along with and good-tempered. The community of Red Bluff was in shock. No one could believe that someone like Cameron could be responsible for such heinous crimes. Cameron went to trial in November of 1984, 8 years after the kidnapping of Colleen Stan. He was charged with 17 counts of rape and sodomy. Janice testified against her husband in a court in exchange for full immunity. The prosecutor, Christine McGuire, did not have the easiest time trying this case. Some of the charges against Cameron were well past the statute of limitations. She had to do a lot of digging and research, as well as find expert witnesses to testify on the behalf of the prosecution to try to get some of those charges to stick. Also, it didn't help that the county where the case was being tried was broke. They couldn't afford to try him. They had already shut down libraries, a couple of schools, and shortened government work weeks to 4 days per week. It was starting to look as if Cameron was going to get off on a plea deal, dropping all of the sex charges and charging him with kidnapping. If this was the case, he would get maybe 10 years and be eligible for parole and half that. He would get less time than he had actually imprisoned Colleen for. Luckily, it was found that it would be in violation of the penal code had a plea deal been offered. So he did go to trial. During the trial, the prosecution showed the photos they had, some of them being Colleen bound and hanging, also a blown-up photo of the contract, and pictures of Janice as well. They also showed some of the equipment that was used, as well as a fully reconstructed version of the coffin-sized box under the bed. Hooker's defense was that Colleen was an adult, and she had the capacity to form a state of consent. They also argued that Colleen had plenty of opportunity to escape, but never did, and that it showed that she had stayed with Cameron on her own free will. The defense also presented a number of letters that were written to Cameron from Colleen. In these letters, she professed her love for him. The letters stunned the courtroom and cast serious doubt on Colleen's story. If she had been so terribly abused, how could she write such strong, loving words to and about her captor? All of the letters were signed by her slave name, Kay. Colleen says that she was chained to a toilet in the bathroom and given a pad of paper and a pen, and Cameron made her write the letters. In the end, Cameron Hooker was sentenced to consecutive terms for kidnapping, rape, and other sex charges, for a total of 104 years of imprisonment. Cameron showed no remorse and said aloud in the courtroom at one point that he should have just killed her. The judge said that he believed Hooker was the most dangerous psychopath that he had ever encountered himself. Cameron was originally not eligible for parole until 2023, but he had his hearing date moved up 7 years to 2015 by California's elderly parole program. and on April 16th, 2015, Cameron Hooker's request for parole was denied. He will be eligible for another hearing in 2022. Colleen spent some of her life after the escape living under another name. But she went on living her life. She was able to go back to school, get an accounting degree. She got married, became a mother, and also became involved in organizations that help abused women. She has since opened up about her story. She's done several interviews. There have also been a few books and movies about her kidnapping. Okay, that was our story for Colleen Stan. She's also known as the girl in the box. Again, I just wanted to thank you all so much for all of your support. And if you like this podcast, please be sure to subscribe and give us a review in iTunes, on Podbean, Overcast, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter at Fatal Podcast. We have a discussion group on Facebook. Just go to facebook.com/groups/Fatal Podcast. You can also read about updates or sneak peeks for the next episode at fatalpodcast.podbean.com. Or you can email me at any time with questions or ideas. Just email fatalpodcast@gmail.com. Again, this is Beth McCarty, signing off. See you next week.